to control the entire world. You see, as long as there's one country shining as a beacon for the rest of the world, the tyrants around the world are held to a standard to which they cannot meet. So the goal of global collectivists is to take down that shining example so that the entire world can be viewed as a single collective. Today, of course, that military power exists. It exists in the hands of the American government, which is why it is so important that the American government remain the beacon for freedom and not a partner in the rising global collective. Secondly, a global collective requires control of the monetary system. Well, here in the United States, that occurred 90 years ago with the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the granddaddy of all American government-private partnerships. Thirdly, a system of child indoctrination needs to be established so that young minds can be molded into the attitudes, values, and beliefs of a global collective. In California, our educational system requires that every government school class have a curriculum designed to create what's called an environmental voter. Our problems have not ended with the passing of Gray Davis and the ascent of Arnold Schwarzenegger. These programs are intended to continue. The United Nations has declared this decade the decade of sustainable development education around the world. It is more and more clear that our children are being indoctrinated to ideas that are foreign to the ideals of liberty. But finally, and what has not been completed, is that for a global collective to exist, natural resources and rural lands must be under the control of the government. It is precisely because in America our rural lands and natural resources have been vested in citizen ownership that this country has fared well and that freedom has served as a beacon for the rest of the world. But that is precisely what sustainable development seeks to attack. These folks are clever. They know that most Americans live in urban areas and don't fully understand the principles I just talked about. But everything we have, everything in this room, everything in our homes, everything in our businesses, had its origin in rural lands and natural resources. And that is where the battle for the future of freedom is resting. So what might we do to help reverse this? Well, the easiest area is to begin to approach our educational process. Understand and work to eliminate the harmful indoctrination programs in the current government education system by dealing with your school boards, informing your neighbors as parents and grandparents of what is actually going on, and understand your own educational alternatives for your children and grandchildren. You see, political theory really boils down to some very simple principles. And in essence, as I suggested at the beginning, in answering the question of who decides, is it the individual or the state deciding the terms of a person's life, there are but two formulations for governmental operation. And we can see those best expressed by looking at the founding documents of this country and the founding documents of the United Nations. In America's case, the principle is based on the ideal of self-governance, which of course leads to liberty, and which is predicated on the idea of unalienable rights, meaning that the right to one's property, which creates the right to one's liberty, which gives to one a life as a human being, is a right that is inherent or imbued into our nature and cannot be stripped away. But with the United Nations, the premise is quite different. You see, state collectivism leads to tyranny, which is based on an idea of human rights, animal rights. In both cases, such rights are granted by men and can be withdrawn by men. They can be selectively enforced for some men and not for other men. What comes can go, because what we have is an elite making the decisions for all others. And today, that is showing itself in the concepts that replace life, liberty, and property. And those concepts are social equity, a new economic system, and environmental justice. You see, the modern war on liberty fosters confusion in our schools regarding the nature of what is a moral government. It causes division by dividing us into groups under the principles of social justice, replacing the concepts of equal justice. And it creates dependency through a welfare system which seeks to undermine free enterprise and establish this new economy. Well, in Santa Cruz, when we began to expose these ideas to the citizenry by taking the issue of sustainable development, or Agenda 21, to the councils that were implementing it, what we would encounter routinely is mockery. Oh, you conspiracy theorists. Well, they don't do that anymore because it's become quite evident by just looking at the United Nations' own website that Agenda 21 and sustainable development are ideas being promulgated by the international political machinery. This is from the United Nations webpage, Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, the Earth Summit, Agenda 21, which was held in Rio in 1992. You see, I sat on the Santa Cruz Agenda 21 committees. Now, this was a lot of crazy ideas. This was back in the mid-90s. Crazy ideas I heard. Mother Earth's surface wasn't to be scratched. Human beings were to be concentrated into human settlement zones. Transportation systems were to be changed. Educational systems were to focus on the environment as the central organizing principle. All aspects of life were covered. There were committees on agriculture, biodiversity, education, energy, housing, government housing, population and its control, public health, social justice, transportation, and a, quote, viable economy. Well, I went to these committees at the request of some people who told me that I needed to understand what was going on, and I came back and I said, this is craziness. This is so silly. It has no chance of having any effect on our society. Well, I was wrong. In the early part of 2001, councils and committees began popping up all over Santa Cruz County. From watershed councils for every small dabbling creek, to fire-safe councils, which were really run by the Department of Interior, coming into Santa Cruz using the fire chiefs as an excuse for imposing a county-wide habitat conservation program that would keep some landowners from walking on their property during the mating season of the long-toed salamander, as an example. Homeowner associations were suddenly changing their bylaws, getting rid of the Roberts Rules of Order and turning to stakeholder and consensus basis. Visioning sessions were held. And suddenly, the newspaper, a compliant partner in this dynamic, began to propagandize the benefits of restructuring our infrastructure, becoming less reliant on cars, creating rails and trails and government-designed housing, dense housing, along the railroad track. But you see, upon further investigation, we found out the County Board of Supervisors had quietly and unanimously, back in 1997, accepted and adopted the provisions of Agenda 21. Looking even a little more deeply, we found out that in 1990, Santa Cruz had passed what was called then the Measure C, which read exactly as the Rio Accords read when they were unleashed on the world 2 years later in 1992. So you see, Santa Cruz has been a laboratory for this dynamic for a long while, and is now beginning to feel the real pinch of massively high housing prices, timberlands that are ready to burn, farmers who are on rich, fertile soil who are having their water taken from them and are about ready to lose their land to collectivized farming. You see, Agenda 21 is a global land use, education, and population control program that doesn't just exist in Santa Cruz. It is now rapidly advancing in every town, burg, and state of the United States. A man named Maurice Strong, a Canadian oil billionaire, was the Secretary General to the United Nations 1992 Conference on the Environment and Development, the so-called Rio Earth